I tell you, my acolytes, life is not as it seems. The wicked and warped creatures of myth are kept from us, not alone by the snuffing out by holier men than us, but also verily by the accursed overguard demiurge of this world. I assure you, Spawn, neither the Vampyri nor the Wendigo hag, nor the undead, nor the humanoid, nor any other largely named mythological beings are illusory or are figments of the imagination, but verily with us, hidden within our ranks, some in this day, some in the past, all to come again as the third day dawns upon us, dies irae. Let us then meet our warped friends, and if the unholy will it, our future selves. Today the undead. First and foremost, our basis and categorizations of the undead. I'd rather split the undead of myth into three categories, you see. The flesh gnawers, the bloodsuckers, and the soul tormentors. The two first are corporeal-based life forms, and the former of the two is most resembling of life in its own life. Flesh gnawers such as zombies, vricolacases, and Wendigo hag eat flesh, chiefly human flesh, to sustain themselves. Bloodsuckers for their part feast on the essence of life in corporeality, often through that which lay in the blood of the living. Soul tormentors for the last feast on the essence of life in the spiritual, the souls and spirits of the living. As for our sources, well, I'll not list the precise literature or anything unless strictly relevant, but generally we'll be looking at synopses of different cultures, myths, and also systems like the Forgotten Realms of Dungeons and Dragons. Not only because they generally take from life, but also because it's oh so fun. Let us begin close to home then, with the vampires. Now Vampyria as a broader phenomenon are a hugely diverse myth, as blood-sucking undeath is rather an easy thing to come up with, or attribute to a broad spectrum of more natural phenomena. Some Eastern cultures say vampires are created by animals jumping over cadavers, or by pagan witches dying. Albanian folklore describes the Dampirs as being spawn of the Karkan Hall, an iron-shirted lycanthrope, and the Lugat, a water-dwelling monster. The modern vampiric myth, however, takes a more demonic approach to the creation of the vampire. There are the interwoven stories of Nosferatu, the name of which derives from Romanian Nosefarit, meaning insufferable, and the story of Dracula, whose name derives from Latin Impaler, also known as Dracula, meaning in Romanian son of the devil. Both describe a vampire with satanic influence. Now the story of Dracula never really mentions a patron demon of the vampire, but Nosferatu does, namely Belial, an archdemon of granting demonic familiars, and the second demon to fall after Lucifer, at least as noted by the Ars Goetia. For its worth, the world of Dungeons and Dragons names the demon lord Orcus of Undeath as the creator of the first vampires. As for the nature of the modern vampire myth, it is arguably an expansion of the Roman myth of the Lamia and the Greek myth of the Vricolakas. See, the Vricolakas strictly hunted after nightfall, giving rise to the modern myth of the vampire bursting in the sun. The Roman Lamia, for its part, was by modern standards a combination of the vampiress and the witch. Unlike the Vricolakas, the Lamia did not burn in the sun or hunt at night, but like the modern vampire, they did feast upon blood. I'm not particularly well read on the Lamiae, but conceivably they would lure their prey to secluded homes with miraculous and diabolical cures, like the Wicked Witch of myth, where they would suck their blood, like the modern vampire. Now I've rather held off on the precise abilities and characteristics of the vampire, but I rather think that not much of a folly on my part. The vampire is, after all, rather a well-known mythical creature, and certainly I'd expect a viewer of the vampire himself to know of vampires. Regardless, let us recap. The modern conceptions of a true vampire are thus. The beastly creature sucks on the blood of at least humans, possibly also on that of the fauna. The wicked creature hunts at midnight, as it burns to cinders in sunlight, or sparkles like a fairy in some laws. It rests only on Saturday, or possibly every day. It is immortal. It is repelled by garlic. It cannot walk into homes without invitation. It can turn into a bat. It can call upon swarms of beasts and of locusts. and it is killed by a wooden stake to the heart. The tales of Dracula and of Nosferatu do not give any account for the reproductions of the vampire, but other sources such as the Twilight Saga and D&D do. The Twilight Saga by Stephanie Meyers doesn't give an exact description for how the first vampires were created, but it does suppose the essence of vampirism to be carried in the vampire's blood by a certain toxin. To create a new vampire then, a vampire must inject his or her toxin directly into a person's heart and bite her several times without ever fully drinking all of the victim's blood. After such a ritual, a new vampire is born. In the world of Dungeons and Dragons, a vampire must fully drain his or her victim's blood with a bite, then bury them. The following night, a new creature, a vampire spawn, rises from the grave as an undead servant to the master vampire, and who is a vampire by its own right in all except in that its ethos is fully enthralled to its masters. The vampire spawn can act alone as much as he wills to, unless it goes against his lord's will. In D&D lore, a true vampire is created only after the vampire spawn bites his vampire lord back, which is very seldom allowed by the lord. Why create a competitor after all, when you could have a slave? The final way of creating a new vampire in some laws is by human vampire reproduction, such as in Twilight. Now Twilight does not name the emerging creature so, but other sources call the child of a vampire and the human a Vampyr, stemming from Balkan, more accurately Albanian phonological shifts and subsequent cultural developments. Vampyrs, unlike vampires, can lead a rather normal life, not burning in the sun and being able to handle garlic and go into homes uninvited and so forth, while still having a taste for blood. Importantly as well, some regard vampires as mortal and some as immortal. In Balkan mythology, vampires also have a keen sight into seeing invisible vampires, and with such become either legitimate vampire hunters, or do so as a cover act to serve their father in one way or another. Vampires have had a meaningful and large contribution to cultural development across the ages, but their reach is also greater than that. Because of the vampire myth, a few species of blood-sucking bats have been named vampire bats. And sort of on that topic, somewhat extending to the creation of the vampire as well, the alt-right violent extremist, left-hand path Satanist group, Order of the Nine Angles, if not being the sole practitioner, is at least the leading proprietor in the creation of the so-called astral vampire, which is outlined in the Codex Aristarchus. Understanding it all requires a rather extensive knowledge of O9A Satanist doctrine, which I'm not getting into here. But the chief aim outlined in the Codex Aristarchus is the creation of a clique of ascendant humans, persons who feast on the life force of others, and in doing so become the top dogs of the food chain. For when the world passes on from a causality to a causality, i.e. after its end. Moving on from the bloodsuckers, the flesh gnawers. Now, in all honesty, there are thousands of myths of paranormal cannibalistic creatures, so we'll just have to focus on a few. Before that, let me morph into something more appropriate. There we go. As I was saying, flesh gnawers. The ones worthy of note, i.e. the ones with interest to me, are ghouls, mummies, revenants, wendigo wights, and of course, zombies. Ghouls are undead cannibals of Arabic myth predating Islam. Now ghouls are, depending on the myth, actually either demons or flesh gnawers as I categorize them. Some stories, specifically those told to women or girls, tell of ghouls as taking the form of a man's past loved one, to lure the man away to feast upon. The key word there is taking. It implies that the ghoul is a demon of sorts, capable of metamorphosis, rather than a merely risen from the dead genre of person. The alternative, of course, is that a ghoul is a person risen from the dead, characteristically rather unchanged from whom he or she was when alive. Some versions of the myth also state that ghouls dwell in caves. All in all, ghouls seem to be of diabolical creation, be its precise origin and nature any way or the other. The ghoul is told to lure its victims to abandoned places or desert wastes to eat them. From Arabia slightly westward, we have Egypt and mummies. Now mummies are ancient, but the undead mummy myth originates from the 19th century Ottoman Empire. European archaeologists ventured into Ottoman Egypt to excavate from the pharaonic era. And oh look, they find mummies, of which they tell back home, and the story of the mummy rising from the dead begins to spread. Now some early mummy literature hosts the mummy as a romantic interest, such as Iras, a mystery. by H.D. Everett, a novel where the protagonist marries a mummy whom takes the form of a beautiful woman. Later on, and more standardly, the myth of the mummy became one of terror. The mummy of myth differs from other undead cannibals in that it is clothed in linen wrappings and is mummified. Additionally, the mummy is sometimes told to be able to temporarily, for all intents and purposes, feast upon its own organs to sustain itself, organs which it predictably replaces with those of later victims. Continuing forth from Egypt to the British Isles, the Revenant is an undead creature of predominantly Celtic myth, but it also echoes throughout Europe. Tales of the Revenant are truly ancient, with archaeologists having found graves following Revenant prevention methods from as early as 4000 BC. Revenants are often children, but regardless of what age the risen to life are, their chief tenet is that they haunt their victims, people familiar to the Revenant in life. Flesh gnawing isn't a standard part of their myths. Whereas vampires are killed with a wooden stake to the heart, Revenants are killed by decapitation and or extensive amputation. Further west, the Wendigo-ag are a Native American brand of cannibalistic monsters. Brief note here, the singular is Wendigo and the standard plural is Wendigos, but I definitely argue the latter should be Wendigo-ag or Wendigo-ag, just as the plural of axolotl should be axolome, and as the plural of cactus is cacti and the plural of octopus is octopodes. Strict loanword should follow the conjugation of the mother language, for the LARP if nothing else. Anyhow, Wendigo-ag. Unlike most other undead creatures, Wendigo-ags don't strictly have to be undead, and perchance their undeath is a rare part of their myth. Nevertheless, they are pretty much cannibal monsters incarnate, so we'll discuss them regardless. In Native American lore, Wendigo-ag are persons who, by eating human flesh, grew a fondness for it, becoming monsters known as Wendigo-ag. Typical of them, as opposed to many other undead flesh gnawers, is a tendency for metamorphosis. The Wendigo-ag appear human in all other circumstances except when feeding, where they turn into hairy, quadrupedal, long-legged, rather famished-looking animals. Next, whites back in Britain. Now whites don't really have a unitary myth to them, but they do appear over and over again in British literature and poetry. Nevertheless, let us suppose something to them rather than abstract undeath. Some sources, such as D&D, note that whites are peculiar in their undeath as extremely violent creatures, very prone to impulsive carnage and slaughter. Such creatures are then predictably born from such persons in life, mass murderers and psychopaths and whatnot. But finally, the leader of the pack, zombies. When you think of the undead, you think of zombies. They are, by all accounts, a rather international notion of myth, with a lot of variety. But let me bring forth one more unitary explanation. The earliest surviving mention of zombies is in the ancient Sumerian text, Descent of Inanna, from as early as 2100 BC, from the third Mesopotamian dynasty of Ur. Here's a translated snippet of that text. If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living. In this snippet, the goddess Ishtar, or Inanna, an ancient goddess of war, love and sex, threatens to raise up the dead to eat the living. This is the chief aspect which makes the zombie myth. A human made risen from the grave to feast upon the living, most often converting most or all upon whom they feast into zombies in kind. Depending upon the story, zombies eat only human brains or flesh indiscriminately, turning their victims likewise into zombies. In tellings following the former of these, it's very analyzable that zombies do not have brains, or have at least very withered ones, which is supported by the universal monomania of their actions, only to feast. As undead beings, zombies are particularly mortal. In many tellings of the zombie myth, if a zombie does not feast, it starves, then dies again. And in rather all tellings, killing a zombie is very easy. Immolation, amputation, and decapitation all are proposed to work most well. Other common characteristics of zombies is a foul stench, ugly permanent rot, an abnormal or slow gait. All in all, then, zombies differ from whites in infecting others, from Wendigo-ag in being truly undead and unmorphing, from revenants in indiscriminate slaughter, from mummies in their rotting rather than mummified body, and from ghouls again in indiscrimination. On to the soul tormentors, and for this bit I'll return to my true self. As a brief recap, or introduction perhaps, to how I classify worldly things, I split human existence to fall across 3 worlds, or planes, or whatever you wish to call them. The corporeal, the spiritual, and the etheric. The corporeal is all that we see, hear, touch, and so forth, physical things. The spiritual is all that we feel, sense, and so forth. It is not strictly our emotions, but rather the things which carry the spirits, that things which bring forth emotions in our understanding, an understanding which happens in the soul, by the way, and by contrast the logical and physical are understood in the mind. In the spiritual world exist spirits, living things, as well as vibes and auras, rather more unliving things. The last world is the etheric, which houses the mind and the soul, and most importantly the will of a living thing. But that's really not important here. The previous 2 types of undead we've gone over were corporeal, but the soul tormentors are more or less spiritual beings. So first of all, animated skeletons, which unlike all the rest are more corporeal rather than spiritual beings. If they would not come as first alphabetically, I might have had a separate middle ground section for them. Nevertheless, inasmuch as they are not even supported by anything in their stature, but simply human skeletons somehow standing upright, I find it rather probable that their stature is supported by a corporealized spirit lifting them up, and thus they go into the soul tormentor category. Nevertheless, skeletons, the undead skeletons, are just as their name suggests. Skeletons come to life. They often symbolize death, for example in medieval European painting, or in general European myth such as the Grim Reaper. Skeletons can also rather carry a positive connotation, such as in Mexico, with the Dia de los Muertos, where the remembered past ones are often pictured as skeletons. There's not much, perchance nothing even, universal to the killing off of a skeleton, so moving on. The banshees are an actual soul tormentor, surely, originally from Irish folklore. Banshees are semi-corporealized spirits, often appearing as tall, skinny women, who herald the death of a family member by screaming, shrieking, or keening, which is a traditionalist Irish chant-like scream for the dead. In being soul tormentors, banshees don't in any precisely familiar ways feed on the corporeal life force of their victims, but rather their spiritual essence by creating terror. Banshees are neither really malevolent or benevolent, but rather just messengers of sorts of the upcoming doom of the mortal and their loved ones. Having delivered their message, the banshee leaves the family alone, and thus needs no killing or exorcism or other. Ghosts, for their worth, are perhaps the most famous of the soul tormentors. Again, they are a rather universal myth, appearing so in some form in all the Abrahamic religions or their more generalized myth, as well as in Hinduism and Buddhism and other religions. The modern ghost of myth is a part corporealizing spirit, said to haunt specific regions near the place of their death, such as a house or village, and the inhabitants therein. Ghosts phase in and out of corporeality, when appearing as visible, usually doing so as see-through and pale white in clothing and visage. Otherwise they merely terrorize their victims by flashing the lights, moving furniture, or other forms of petty sabotage. Again, with it being a soul tormentor, the ghost lives by feasting from the spiritual force of its victims, usually wounding their spirits with terror and fear. Depending on the story, ghosts are either killed by exorcism or by them fulfilling what was left unfulfilled by them in life, whatever that may be. Should one suppose a distinction to ghosts, phantoms are specifically a vengeful and malicious type of soul tormentor. In being vengeful spirits, phantoms are less corpo-spatially restricted, but rather bound to a person and his spirit. Phantoms are typically more subtle than ghosts, enacting their terror not in fear but in misfortune, and far less often appearing corporeally to their victim. Like ghosts, phantoms are killed once they are fulfilled in their mission, tormenting their past tormentors in equal amounts as they did, or when exorcised. Poltergeists are soul tormentors from Germanic myth. Poltergeists are generally renowned for physical disturbances, such as moving or breaking objects, hitting, clawing, or tripping their victims, and also in causing objects to levitate. Like ghosts, poltergeists are most often spatially bound, but unlike ghosts, they seldom are told to have any larger agenda of fulfilling something left unfulfilled, but rather continuing to terrorize for the reason of continuing to exist in undeath, Unlike ghosts and phantoms, poltergeists never take a semi-corporeal form. Now if one wants to make a distinction again, spectres are a type of ghosts that more specifically focus on the emotional terrorization aspect. I really can't find many sources describing spectres, so let's conjecture for the sake of at least making a definitional distinction between types of ghosts, if nothing more. Spectres do not appear semi-corporeally ever, and they do not interact with the corporeal world. Rather, they feast on the spirits of their victims, more directly influencing the spiritual world. They are, in a word, vibe incarnate. One must assume they are gotten rid of as poltergeists in exorcism. Finally have we wraiths, which again see no specific universal definitions. More often than not they are synonymous with ghosts. But let us in conjecture give some difference for the sake of separate categorizations. Wraiths are rather place-bound, like ghosts. But unlike ghosts, they are strictly traditionally evil in nature, tormenting for the sake of pleasure from torment. And when appearing, they do not take the form of a translucent or transparent pale version of themselves in life, but rather the form of a deep, dark shadow. Therewith, at a measly rough 3,400 words, I shall end this video. If I feel so inclined, which I find probable, I'll make a new video and make this a series, presenting other fantastical and morbid creatures of myth. For now, bye.